2017, a friend of ours told us the suicide rates in our community, and we were just baffled. My husband, my 2 young daughters, and myself got in our car on a dreary, rainy Saturday afternoon to stake 20 yard signs around our small town of Newberg, Oregon. The signs said things like, "Don't give up, your mistakes don't define you, and you're worthy of love." It's the helplessness, I don't know how to help, but I want to be of help. And I thought of this idea I had several years ago to make these yard signs with encouraging words on them. Well, when we got home from staking these 20 signs around town, I had a neighbor who messaged me and said, "I think you're the ones who did this, but you should go on Facebook, people are talking about them. And not only that, they want signs in their yards." And that is how the movement started. Pretty quickly into developing this movement, which was totally accidental, we realized we had to scale because there were a lot of requests coming from a lot of different directions. And now it wasn't just Oregon, it was all over. So we built a website, we made an e-commerce, and we started to get more legit in how we ran our side of things. Well, that made it accessible for people to share on Instagram. People are wanting to spread the hope in their towns. And that spread in the last 5 months to 25 different states and to 8 different countries. So people are taking it and running with it. One of the neatest things to see is how it really connects people. The lady in Newberg who had someone outside her home pulled over in front of their yard, in front of the sign, weeping over their steering wheel. So she goes out there and knocks on the glass. "Can I help you? Is something wrong?" And the woman is so touched by her yard sign that says, "You matter," that they share this sweet moment of vulnerability with each other before they head to work. So the byproduct of creating moments like this, I never in a million years would have seen coming. And the second byproduct is probably meeting other people like-minded. There's actually a lot of hope and a lot of good happening. It just doesn't make the news always. And I've made some really neat connections with people in my community that are doing similar crazy movements, and now we're kind of all in this together. People are really thirsty for truth and love and hope. I think it's just a little astonishing that something so simple can be so profound.
I love the story of Amy Wolf and her family, how they went and they saw a need and they filled that need. They heard about all of the suicide rates rising in their community. They heard about everybody who was depressed and sad in their community. And she looked at her husband and said, "Let's fill that need. Let's go and love on those people. We may not be able to give every single person a hug because we don't know all these people, but let's go love on our community." And so they made all these yard signs, and she went viral. And like she said, it just spread throughout the country into other countries. And what we should be here at the Grove, we should be a sign of hope as well. We need to be a sign of hope, not just to our church, not just to the people in our church, but to this community, to the people in Arizona, because there's so many people right now struggling with depression and suicide and thoughts of self-harm. And so when they walk through our doors, we want them to know that this is a place of hope. There's signs of hope here and that Jesus loves them. I'm the youth pastor here at the Grove, and I have the opportunity to work with young people at our church and in our community. And it seems like on a weekly basis, I'm having a conversation with a teenager about suicide or depression or anxiety now. I've sat with so many parents almost every week now, and they're coming to me with a suicidal teenager or a teenager who has tried to attempt suicide. I've had teenagers in this community post countdown clocks on their social media stories as to when they're going to kill themselves. I've had our teenagers here at the church watch their friends commit suicide on their social media live stories. And we've had to walk with our students through this now, walk through that trauma, walk through that pain, walk through that depression that they've gone through. Depression used to be something that was out there. It used to be something that we didn't have to deal with. It used to be something that was just for celebrities and pop culture stars and athletes and the uber rich and famous. But it's not anymore. It's right here. It's in our families. It's in our community. It's in our schools. and we're facing it. And the question we have to ask ourselves going forward now is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to deal with this issue? And that's our question this morning. I love this quote by Edward Ziegler. He's a famous Yale psychologist. He says that depression is the common cold of psychological disorders. It's the common cold of psychological disorders. And so when we look at depression, we see that it can affect the old, the young, the rich, the poor, celebrities, not celebrities, Christian, not Christian. It can affect anybody. I've heard it said about depression, and maybe you've heard it said too, that depression is demon possession, that depression is God's face turned away from you, that depression is just judgment, God's judgment on some sort of sin in your life. And what we need to understand about this is that none of these things that we hear are true. That those things about depression that we hear, about those old things about depression, aren't true. The Christian church hasn't dealt very well with many topics in the past, over the past few thousand years, and one of those issues is the topic of depression, and that's why so often we hear things like that regarding depression. So going forward this morning, what we want to do is squash those ideas of depression, squash those sayings of depression. Thank you, yeah. It's so important for our youth, for our preteens, and for our young adults that are struggling with depression and suicide, for your coworkers that are struggling with depression and suicide, for them to understand that it's okay and that they have help around them. This morning, we're going to be closing out our series on wellness and mental health. And our topic this morning is obviously depression. And we want to help you navigate the road on depression a little bit better. And so we're going to be looking at some of the warning signs on the road to depression. There are a lot of warning signs on the road to depression, and we don't have time in the next 20 minutes to look at all of them. So what we're going to do is look at 3 of the major warning signs on the road to depression. And some of you are thinking already, this is just depressing. I shouldn't have come to church this morning. Yeah, should have stayed home and just hung out and be a lot more joyful than this. It's having a good summer so far. But here's what I want to say. Hang in, because I think this is so critical. Because even if you're not depressed or your family is in a really happy spot and your family's doing great, that's awesome. That's really good. You're doing a great job. But somebody you know, I bet, I can guarantee it, somebody you know is struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts, whether you know it or not. Maybe it's a coworker or a child's friend at school, and you can be the adult in their life. You can be the adult that comes and says, hey, there's hope. You can be the voice of reason in their life. You can be the voice of Jesus Christ in their life that comes and offers them hope in their most vulnerable moment, when they really need it, when they need to get help and when they need to get counseling. You can come to them and say, hey, there is hope for you. When we look at the Bible, and we're going to be opening up our Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 19, when we look at our Bible, we see depression throughout the scriptures, and a lot of people are kind of surprised at that, but depression is all throughout the scriptures. A lot of the Bible characters really struggled with depression. A lot of the prophets struggled with depression. They had really hard lives, and they had a lot of bouts with depression. We're going to be looking at the prophet Elijah in the Old Testament, and he had a big bout of depression. He had just had this huge victory. He defeated all these cult prophets, these evil men, and then he finds out that someone, the queen, wants to kill him. So he's running for his life, and we pick up his story in 1 Kings 19:1. It says, now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. That's heavy words. if you have known someone who is suicidal or depressed and they've told you that they just want to die, if the world is a better place without them, then you know how heavy this is. I've heard kids say that, and this is some heavy stuff that we're dealing with. As we look at Elijah's story, we kind of see the perfect storm of depression brewing in his life, and we see all these warning signs of depression popping up that he should have noticed. The first warning sign that he should have noticed reads a lot like this. It says, if we have it on the screen, it says, he received some bad news. Elijah received some bad news from the queen that she wants him dead. He had just had this huge victory. He just defeated all these cult prophets of the god Baal, and he's now running for his life. I think if someone said that you have a bounty on your head, the queen wants your head on a silver platter, there's a contract on my life, a hitman is after me, I think that would give 99% of us just a little bit of anxiety. If I was going to death row, I would sink into some depression. And so Elijah hears this news after being on top of the world, and he sinks into a little bit of depression. He starts running for his life. Because here's the thing, there was a lot of Israelites who were worshiping the god Baal, and then they turn their hearts and start worshiping Yahweh at that day, the day before in chapter 18. And so instead of turning her heart, Queen Jezebel, to Yahweh, instead of worshiping God like she should have, like he expected, she wants to spread her wickedness and spread her evil throughout the kingdom, throughout the lands, throughout the ancient Near East even more. And she says, I'm going to come after you. I'm going to kill you. Isn't it funny how he's in this book, he's not afraid of 850 evil, creepy men, but one woman makes him run for his life. It's so bizarre, but it's so true to this day. A lot of guys are like, oh. If you're taking notes, write this down. Almost always depression is preceded by some type of bad news. Depression is almost always preceded by some type of bad news that we receive. There was this old man, and the old man is sitting on a street corner, and he's just sobbing uncontrollably. And this guy walks up to him, and he says, oh, hey, what's going on? And the old man looks up with tears in his eyes, and he says, I'm 85 years old, and I'm married to a 22-year-old gorgeous blonde that's madly in love with me. And the guy looks at him and says, so what's the problem? And the old man looks up at him with tears in his eyes, and he says, because I can't remember where I live. It's dumb, but the point is, when something bad happens, we all get upset about it. No matter how small it is, if it's something big, we're more upset, especially if it's one of the dreaded D words. There's 4 D words if you're taking notes: divorce, disaster, disease, or death. Some of these things can make us sink into a deep sadness. These things can make us depressed. If you've ever experienced divorce, disease, disaster, or if someone close to you has died, you can experience feelings of depression or some real sadness, because losing somebody is hard. I lost my grandpa in March, and I was really close to him. He was a real mentor in my life, someone I was very close to, and I mourned his death with my family. But then after a few months, it was time to move on. It was time to go back to normal life. If you've lost someone close to you and you didn't mourn that person, you didn't experience feelings of sadness, that would be a little weird, right? And I want to say this about mourning and about sadness and depression. If you know someone who is going through mourning and depression and loss right now, and it's been about 6 months, and that person has not gotten back to normal life, and they're not enjoying life, they haven't gotten back out of the house, then that person needs a little help. Maybe you can be the voice in their life to say, hey, it's time to get some help. We need to get you back on your feet. We need to get you into some counseling because you're not in a great spot, and we need to get you to a better spot. And it's time to take those steps now. You need to be that voice in their life, and I'm encouraging you to be that person if you know that person. When I look at Elijah's life, I see his humanity. In James 5:17, we read about his humanity. James is writing about Elijah, and he writes this. He writes, Elijah was a human being, even as we are. It seems so simple, and it seems like we could skip right over that, but it's actually kind of profound if we think about it. He was a human being even as we are. When we think about Bible people and Bible women and Bible men, we often think in the back of our minds they're so much greater than I am. They're so much more perfect than I am. David was way better than I am. Esther was a much better woman than I am. And we keep them on this pedestal up here. But James is saying something super profound here. They were just human. They had a human nature just like we do. Paul killed people. David committed adultery. They had sin in their life. So in this context, when we're reading about Elijah, it's important to remember that he had a sin nature and a human nature and experienced feelings, just like we experience feelings. So when he received this bad news, he got depressed because he had a human nature. So if you know someone who got some bad news, or if you know someone who's depressed, don't judge them. Know that they're going through something and know that you can help them, but know they're going through something for a reason. And that's why it's so critical to see these warning signs. That's why it's so critical for that person or for you to recognize these warning signs that we're looking at this morning. And we're going to look at the second warning sign. And if you're taking notes, they're flip-flopped on the note sheet. The second warning sign is this: coming down from a major victory. Coming down from a major victory or a high, if you've struggled with addiction. For Elijah, he's coming down from a major victory. And for Elijah, he had just had this huge all-day battle with these cult prophets of the god Baal, and he's defeated all of these 850 men. He's won all of the hearts of the people in Israel, which is a big deal. Think about it. If we had turned everybody Christian in this whole town, that'd be a big deal. He essentially did that. And all of these people are now worshiping Yahweh. And they're like, man, Elijah, you're a celebrity in town. You're a big deal. And he's going viral. And, in today's standards, they're looking at him like, you're our new guy. You're our preacher. You're our celebrity guy. What can we do now? And he's like, well, let's go to brunch. Let's come back tomorrow. We'll do this again. But that's his mountaintop. If you've ever had a mountaintop experience, if you're there right now with your family, if things are going well, if you've had a great summer, you've had some awesome vacations, things are good at work, they've been there for the last couple of seasons, you know what it's like to be on top. You know what that mountaintop feels like. Maybe your family is there and it's a good place to be. But when you're on top, you're also at your most vulnerable point, and that's where Elijah was. When I think about these mountaintop experiences and being on top and having success, I instantly, because I'm a sports guy, I think about athletes. Because I think more than any of us, they know what it's like to be on top. They know what it's like to hold up NBA trophies, LeBron and Steph Curry and now Kawhi Leonard. And Serena Williams, when she hoists up a lot of her Wimbledon trophies, they know what it's like to be on top and have success. I was thinking about Deion Primetime Sanders. He epitomizes success almost more than any other athlete. He went to 2 Super Bowls and he went to a World Series. He was one of the greatest athletes to play professional sports. It was 1997 and Deion Sanders had gone to 2 Super Bowls. He'd gone to a World Series. He'd released an album. He'd been making a ton of money. He had a family. Things were great in front of the curtain. Behind the curtain, his marriage is crumbling. He's about to get a divorce from his wife. In his autobiography, he writes that he felt empty inside, that he didn't have any peace. He was without joy, and he said he felt like he was running on fumes. So he went and he got in his car, and he drove off of a 35-foot cliff. But Deion Primetime Sanders, because he's almost superhuman, got out of the car, almost without a scratch on his body, got down on his hands and knees, looked up to God, and asked God to come into his life. It was a miracle, and I get chills every time I read his story. He's an example of what it means to be on top of a mountain, to have it all, but to be at your most vulnerable point. You see, it's a scary place to be when you're on top because the only place you can go is down. I think about us more basic humans that aren't superstar athletes like Deion Sanders or LeBron James. And I can relate it this way because at Christmas, what's Christmas? It's awesome. It's the best time of the year. We come to the Grove, we sing these awesome worship songs, we get this amazing feeling. We all feel, we get that really good, fuzzy, warm feeling inside. We go home to all of our family that's in town, and it's amazing for most of us. We eat all of this great food, and we, eat a lot of it, and it's amazing, and we eat a lot of dessert, and it's amazing. And we have a lot of family time and give a lot of gifts, and we're very generous, and it's amazing. But then all of those experiences, all that time, all that good family time, it comes to an end, and the kids go back to school, and the house is empty, and we have to go sit back in our office, and New Year's Eve passes, and we have to make some resolutions, and we get back on a diet, and it's not so amazing. It's kind of sad and depressing. And if you've struggled with addiction in the past, and if you've struggled with binging, or if you've picked up some new addictions during the holiday season, your brain is not in a good place. Your brain has been experiencing all these highs, or all these new highs. It's been producing all these chemicals. And I'm no expert on this topic. I'm not claiming to be this morning. We have experts in this room. We have doctors in this room at the Grove, I know we do, who know much more about this topic. But I know that life is full of highs and lows. And when you're experiencing these highs, even if you're not suffering from an addiction, when you're experiencing these highs, life is also full of lows. And I don't want to be a prophet of doom this morning, or a prophet of despair, someone who's just bringing depressing feelings, but I want to warn you that life has lows. It has lows for your family. It has lows for your kids. It has lows for your spouse. And so if you've been up here, if you've been experiencing a great season, a mountaintop season, that's something to be proud of. That's something to celebrate. But you also need to be prepared for when your spouse experiences a low season, when your kids go through a low season, when your kids' friends hit rock bottom. How are you preparing for that season? How are you preparing for rock bottom now? What are you doing today to take those steps when someone comes to you and says, I've hit rock bottom? What were you doing at your mountaintop? Because if it's you, you should have been prepared. Elijah wasn't. Elijah was on the mountaintop one day, and the very next day, he hit rock bottom. We read about his rock bottom moment in 1 Kings 19:5 as we continue his story. In 1 Kings 19:5, Elijah says, I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the tree, and he fell asleep. It's in this verse, just in 4b and 5, where we see two warning signs. And if you've ever been in a relationship or a friendship and talked to someone who's dealing with suicide and depression, you can see two warning signs here, because what he's doing is the first warning sign that we're not going to talk about. We don't have time for that. This is a sermon for another time, but this is a cry for help. This is a cry for help. And I've seen so many people have a cry for help like Elijah, and maybe we can talk about that another time. But the warning sign that we're going to talk about right now is that he is exhausted. He's physically exhausted. Elijah has been overworked. He's worn out. He's tired. He's been going for days and years, and he's just burned out. He's done. Elijah was going for an entire day when he was fighting against the Baal prophets, and they were cutting themselves. They were doing all these crazy things to get fire to rain down from heaven on their altar to prove that Baal was the real God. And so he's mentally drained because that was a crazy experience. And if you've been mentally drained, you know that that can almost be more draining and burn you out more than being physically exhausted. And then the next day he finds out in our story that the queen wants him dead. So he runs 30 miles in the story through the desert. He runs a full marathon to a bush and lays down and asks to die. And now he's physically exhausted to the point where he doesn't want to live anymore. He's been working and working. He could be labeled a workaholic and working for God and working. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? We can relate in some aspects. I've been working and working because I'm a good American. I've been working and working because I'm good for my company. I've been working and working because my family needs it and it's good for my family. I'm working and working because a promotion is probably coming up. I'm working and working, but the problem with working and working, there's a real problem there. The problem with working and working and working is you're more vulnerable to thoughts and feelings of anxiety and stress and burnout, and ultimately thoughts and feelings of depression when you're working and working and working. There was a father, and the father, he's at home one day and sits on his couch one Saturday morning, and he pulls out his laptop, And he starts doing some work, and his first grade son looks over at him and he says, "Hey, Dad, what are you doing?" And the father looks at his son and he says, "Oh, I'm just finishing up some work that I didn't get done at the office." And the son looks at his dad and he says, "Hey, Dad, when you go back to the office on Monday, can you tell them to put you in a slower group?" Some of you need to go back to the office on Monday and just ask to be put in a slower group. Even if it's just for a short season, even if it's just for a week or 2 weeks, and some of you have that power. Some of you can say, "I'm just gonna be put in a slower group just for a week, just while the kids go back to school, just so I can have some more family time, just for my health, just for my family's health. I'm gonna slow it down just for a week." There's a reason, and if you take one thing away, take this away this morning. There's a reason God commands us to Sabbath. Sabbath is critical to your health and to your family's health. It's not optional, it's a command. It's more than an hour here on Sunday. It's more than a few worship songs and a talk and a coffee. It's an entire day of rest where we put away our to-do list, where we unplug, where we log out for an entire day, where we're disconnected and we rest for an entire 24-hour period. And it sounds nuts now, but it's something that we take very seriously. Maybe you do it on Saturday, maybe you do it on Thursday. Whenever you do it, I really encourage you to do that, because if you don't, you're gonna encounter burnout if you haven't already. And when we look at Elijah's story, Elijah encountered burnout because he wasn't taking rest seriously. He wasn't resting, he wasn't sleeping, he wasn't eating. And some of you are there right now, and you're starting to have those feelings of anxiety, and maybe it's because you aren't resting. What I love about this story, though, I love that his story doesn't end under a bush dying, because that would actually be depressing. But what I love is we get to keep reading the story, and it goes on. When we read in 1 Kings 19, 6-9, we read this. "He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then he lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, 'Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you.' So he got up and he ate and he drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into the cave and he spent the night." God sends an angel of hope because he's the God of hope. And the angel of hope goes and he touches Elijah, who's in the pit, who's in his most depressed, lowest moment in life. And he says, "Hey, wake up and eat." What we've been going through this morning so far are the 3 warning signs of depression, which are critical for you to know so that you can help other people. But we want to help other people who are struggling. We want to help your friends and your family members and the youth in this community who are struggling. And as we finish this story, what we see is we see God bringing hope to Elijah. He's going to bring a future to Elijah. He's going to bring him 3 signs of hope. And as we look at these 3 signs of hope, I want you to be able to learn how you can also bring hope to people who are struggling around you. And I believe that God, the first sign that he brings to Elijah when he sends the angel, reads something like this. He comes up to Elijah and he says, "Hey, buddy, you need to take it one day at a time." Hey, Elijah, hey, bud, you just have to take it one day at a time. And Elijah gets tapped on the shoulder by the angel, and he looks over and he sees some bread and he sees some water, and the angel says, "Eat." And God meets Elijah's physical needs first because he's exhausted and he's tired and he's hungry and he's thirsty. So God meets him where he needs it the most. I was talking to Pastor Scott Swanson about this scripture earlier this week, and Pastor Scott said, "Hey, sometimes you just have to eat your feelings." I said, "Is that biblical?" He said, I think it's right here. Yes. Sometimes you need to take a tub of ice cream and go sit on the couch and just binge watch some Netflix for a night or 2 or 4. Don't go longer than 2 weeks maybe. I'm not going to recommend that. But maybe sometimes you just need to sit and eat and relax and rest and recover from burnout and from the things that you've been going through. Maybe somebody you know is really stressed out and really anxious and going through a lot. Maybe you need to take them a plate of cookies or some brownies or some Dutch Bros. Scratch the Dutch Bros. Take them some brownies and just say, hey, you need to recover. You need to rest and take it one day at a time and then get back on your feet. Because that's what God did for Elijah. He said, it's okay to take it one day at a time because the journey is long ahead. The second sign that God brings to Elijah, I believe it reads like this. Look up, Elijah. And he comes and he taps him on the shoulder. And he says, hey, Elijah, look up, buddy. Hey, bud, it's time to look up. Because for so long, Elijah, he had been looking down. Elijah had been looking down at his circumstances. He'd been looking down at his problems. He'd been looking down at his to-do list. Been looking down at his anxiety, which, what does that sound? Sounds so familiar. I'm looking down at my to-do list. I'm looking down at my work. I'm looking down at my kids' problems. I'm looking down at the dog. I'm looking down at my bills. There's a big problem here. When we take our eyes off of God and when we're just looking down at everything in front of us, we move away from God, we move away from our faith, and we move into a place of anxiety and stress and aloneness because we're not connected to God, we're not connected to our faith, and we move into a place of isolation and depression ultimately if you're not connected to God and looking up to him. And that's where Elijah ended up. I love this quote from Deion Sanders in his autobiography regarding this. And Deion says this. He said, I don't believe you can be at your optimum without your faith. My faith is everything. It's the gas that propels, the courage, the truth that keeps me going. It's the wind in my wings. It's the air that pumps into my lungs that provokes me to live. Faith is everything. Dion was on top and fell, and after he fell, he got out of that car and got on his knees, and he looked up to God because it was the only place that he knew he could go. Sometimes you just have to look up. In Psalms 42:11, we read this Bible verse. It says, why am I so sad? Why am I so upset? I tell myself, wait for God's help. You will again be able to praise him, your God, the one who will save you. So even if you don't feel like it, take 15 minutes every single morning and do those devotions. Even if you don't feel like it, take some time to pray in the morning. Even if you don't feel like it, come here on Sundays. Come here once a week so that you can be surrounded by your brothers and sisters and worship. Even if you don't feel like it, turn on that Christian music in the car so that you can be encouraged by the Lord. Even if you don't feel like it, you get on your hands and knees and pray to God every single day without fail because the journey is long. And if you're disconnected from him, you're going to fail without a fail every single time because you will get discouraged if you're not looking up to God. I love this last sign of hope that God offers Elijah. And this sign says, you aren't alone. You aren't alone, Elijah. Hey, bud, and he taps him on the shoulder. You aren't alone. Even though it feels like you are alone, even though it feels like nobody cares, even though it feels like the world would be a better place without you, I need you to know that you aren't alone. And Elijah, if you would just look up, you would see that I've reserved 7,000 Israelites who haven't bowed down to the other cult god. And if you just look up, I'd see that you need to go lead that remnant in Israel. Hey, bud, if you just look up, you'd see that you aren't alone because your best friend, Elisha, your apprentice, he's waiting for you back in the city. And if you just look up, you'd see that I have this whole plan, this whole journey waiting for you. And if you just look up, you would see all of this. You would see my whole plan is unfolding right in front of your very eyes if you would just look up. I believe there's so many people that are struggling with this, and I really do believe this morning that there's someone in this room that needs that message. And so I want to encourage you and tell you this morning that if you would just look up, if you would just keep your eyes going towards God and not on your problems and look up, you would see that you have brothers and sisters, you have a whole family surrounding you right now whose arms are ready to take you in, and they've been ready to take you in. If you would just look up. If you just look up, you'd see that your God has been waiting for you this entire time, that he wants to come into your life and forgive you so many times for everything in your past. If you just look up, he's waiting to give you so much more than you could ever have asked for. If you just look up. He did it for me when I was just a broken down kid. It took me getting on my hands and knees, and I had to look up. And maybe today he's saying to you, just look up. I'll close with this story. There's a famous psychologist, his name was Dr. Carl Menninger, and he was giving a lecture. And in the lecture, someone asked Dr. Carl Menninger, they said, "Doctor, if someone is having a nervous breakdown, what would you recommend that person do?" And a lot of people in the audience thought that Dr. Carl Menninger would say to go see their therapist, or that they should go and call a counselor and seek help immediately. But much to everybody's surprise in the audience, Dr. Carl Menninger said that that person should go and lock up their house and go across the railroad tracks and find someone in dire need and help that person. My challenge for you this morning is, who can you help? Can you take some drastic steps this morning to find someone in dire need who really needs help and help that person? My final challenge to you is this: who can you be a sign of hope to? Who can you be a sign of hope to in this community going forward? Who can you be a sign of hope to in your family? Who can you be a sign of hope to that drastically needs it right now? Somebody who's suicidal, somebody that's sinking into depression. Who can you be a sign of hope to?